Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers who had the courage and the ingenuity to change plans and set up all the logistics for this virtual conference in just a few weeks, and in the difficult context of the COVID crisis. This is amazing. Thank you for offering us the opportunity to experiment with new tools and practices that will help us reduce the carbon footprint of our research activities. Thank you for offering us the opportunity to meet, virtually though, and exchange ideas. It is important, all the more as I believe that the current crisis is making the topic of the conference even more important. Isn't this crisis as well a unique, though painful, moment to take a step back from our normal lifestyles and reflect on which lifestyles we really want, what is a good life for all, and how to make it happen? So, I will talk about the role of lifestyles and lifestyle change in pathways compatible with climate change mitigation goals and development goals. To do so, I'll take successively 3 different hats. First, my hat as an IPCC author for the 6th assessment report in Working Group 3 on mitigation for the chapter Mitigation Pathways Compatible with Long-Term Goals, and previously as a reviewer and reader of IPCC Assessment Reports. Then I'll take my hat of an economist and integrated assessment modeler at CRED, my research lab, the International Research Center on Environment and Development. And finally, I'll take my hat of a member of the French Climate Change Committee, le Haut Conseil pour le Climat, an independent institution tasked to assess and provide recommendation for public policy on climate change in France. And a short disclaimer, even if I have several hats, my opinions remain mine and don't necessarily reflect the positions from the institution mentioned here. So I'll put my first hat as an IPCC Assessment Reports reader, reviewer, and now author. For quite some time, the core of the literature on mitigation and on mitigation pathways in particular has been focusing on technologies. Meanwhile, studies on lifestyles and demand-side mitigation solutions were less numerous and less in the front line, I would say. The dominant view in practice could be seen as for modelers to take lifestyles and energy demand services as given and focus on the supply system to provide these demands. For economists, lifestyles and consumption choices would be reflecting what people want, the revealed preferences from the Homo economicus. For policymakers, lifestyles were not considered an area for policies, even less for negotiations, as famously declared George W. Bush at the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. The American way of life is not up for negotiation, period. This dominance or bias towards technology-oriented mitigation literature is very much reflected in IPCC 5th assessment report, which was released in 2014. In its chapter 6 on assessing transformation pathways, the emphasis is very much on the roles of technologies in mitigation pathways. I'm not saying that literature on lifestyles was inexistent, nor that it's totally absent from the IPCC assessment, simply that it was less emphasized at the time. When technology or technological system in particular took center stage, the biomass energy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. The scenarios in the category of greenhouse gases concentration stabilization between 430 and 480 ppm CO2 equivalent, which is roughly equivalent to a likely 2-degree category, have a large-scale biomass energy system in 2100, ranging from 200 to 350 exajoule per year, and that represents between 25 and 50% of total primary energy. And BECCS represents a share between 40% and 100% of that biomass energy. In the modeling frameworks, BECCS is a sort of a magic wand that makes it easier to reach tight carbon budget because it allows to have negative emissions. Biomass captures CO2 from the atmosphere while growing, and it is then used to produce energy while capturing and storing CO2 in geological reservoirs. But in the real world, magic wands are no panacea. And since the release of the assessment report, numerous studies have, rightly I think, questioned or criticized the reliance on BECCS in mitigation pathways from many angles. From the evaluation of its mitigation potential that may be more limited than initially thought, from the many trade-offs or negative side effects it implies, competition for land use and water use, negative impact on biodiversity, on indigenous population, impacts on food prices and food security, etc. It also remains very uncertain and represents a gamble, put at risk the attainment of the mitigation goal and represent a diversion from other mitigation solutions that need to be implemented now. And an aspect less studies, but I think maybe the most important, is that BECCS and negative emissions more generally pose an intergenerational equity issue. The burden is left to future generations to deploy the technology and bear the negative side effects, or suffer from the impacts of more severe climate change. All these gave very good reasons to explore alternative pathways compatible with mitigation goals that rely less or do not rely at all on the BECCS magic wand that exists in models but may not exist at scale or pose a number of risks in the real world. The need to explore alternative, or maybe I should say complementary and additional mitigation solutions has been reinforced over time, with the mitigation challenge becoming more and more urgent, the remaining carbon budget being squeezed from both sides, from ever-increasing global emissions until last year, and from the mounting evidence that impacts from climate change in a 2-degree world would already entail large risks and losses, and that a 1.5 goal is to be considered. So modeling teams have started to explore alternative pathways, and in the IPCC special report on the 1.5 goal, lifestyle changes and low demand scenarios are starting to take center stage. One of the 4 illustrative pathways that were chosen to convey key messages from the assessment is precisely the low energy demand pathway from the paper by Grabler and co-authors. In next assessment report, the 6th assessment report that will be released next year, lifestyles and demand-side mitigation options will take even more prominence, I think, in many of the chapters and with one dedicated chapter, as you can see in the outline of the report here, with Chapter 5 on demand, services, and social aspects of mitigation. But back to the special report on 1.5 and its illustrative pathways. The authors of the summary for policymakers have chosen 4 different pathways to highlight that their 1.5 goal can be reached with different trajectories that share common characteristics: peak of global emission early, fast decrease of global emissions, and some amount of carbon dioxide removal, CDR, or negative emissions, but also differences. Basically that if peak is a little delayed and reduction of emissions a little slower, it has to be compensated by more negative emission. The first illustrative pathway is precisely the low energy demand scenario from the paper by Grabler and co-authors. One thing that is not related to lifestyle changes, but is important so that what I'm trying to say is not misinterpreted. Whatever the pathway, some amount of negative emission is necessary. But the scale of negative emissions is precisely what varies with the pathway and with the assumption of lifestyle changes or absence of thereof. And the IPCC authors go further with the following key message. 1.5 pathways that include low energy demand, low material consumption, and low greenhouse gases intensive food consumption have the most pronounced synergies and the lowest number of trade-offs with respect to sustainable development and the SDGs. High confidence. Such pathways would reduce dependence on CDR. In model pathways, sustainable development, eradicating poverty, and reducing inequality can support limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. High confidence. I was not involved in the Brabler et al. Paper, but let me give you a few words on the characteristic of the LED pathway and how it was constructed. The scenario is based on an energy service perspective with a vision that combines a reduction of the amount of services, for example, the number of passenger kilometers traveled, changes in the form of the services, for example, a switch from private cars to public transport, and improvement of services efficiency, for example, carpooling or improved energy efficiency of motors. The storyline it is based on assumes some megatrends in digitalization, multifunctionality, sharing economy, etc. And the energy demand is quantified off-model and then fed to the integrated assessment model message as exogenous demand trajectory. It results in global final energy demand in 2050 that is equal to 250 exajoule per year, to be compared to today's final energy demand of 410 exajoule per year. So we have a new landscape where the question of demand-oriented mitigation solutions and lifestyle changes is moving from the fringe to the center. And we have two strong messages. Lifestyle changes, low energy service demand, sufficiency are key to avoid over-reliance on negative emissions that entail several major risks in low-carbon pathways. In pathways that include assumptions on lifestyle change and consumption change, have less trade-off with other SDGs, less trade-off with food security and hunger eradication, less trade-off with good health and well-being, etc. However, the model pathway leaves open many questions, and one may wonder whether we've just not swapped a magic wand, the Beck's magic wand, for another magic wand, the lifestyle change magic wand, a different kind of magic wand with different challenges, uncertainty and risks, but risks nonetheless. And in particular, I think there are two broad and important questions. First, what are really the economic and social implications of such low demand trajectories? And then, how to make such rapid and profound transformations of lifestyles and demand patterns happen? And the link between the two, depending on how low demand trajectory would unfold, the economic and social implications could be vastly different. So 2 questions, 2 other hats. With the second hat, I would like to remind ourselves that thinking about the role of lifestyles in development and mitigation pathways has a long history, even if it was not necessarily center stage. I'll take the opportunity to share with you a diagram that I learned during my PhD as it was passed from one generation to another at CRED, my research lab. The origins of it are due to Ignacy Sachs, who founded CRED in the early 70s, and who is also the father of the concept of eco-development. This diagram highlights that it's the conjunction, the interactions between consumption and time users choices, technology and resource users choices, and location and space users choices that are both individual and collective choices that determine development patterns and lifestyles. For instance, the type of space use, urban forms, and existing infrastructure interact with the transport technologies people have access to and time use choices to shape how mobility looks like. The element in the middle are the suggested criteria to assess the situation, the trajectory resulting from the interactions between consumption, technologies, and location. In blue, the effects on the physical world, energy, resources, and land. In green, the effects on the environment. And in orange, the effects on the human dimensions, on development and well-being, and on employment. What I find useful in this diagram is that it forces us to think about complex interactions in the system. With this in mind, as a modeler, we can try to model this complex set of interactions and the dynamic evolutions of the systems, but also have to remain humble about what a model can embark and fully embrace the need for interdisciplinary work here. So, as modelers, we should always ask ourselves the following questions. Should lifestyle changes be represented as exogenous or endogenous to the system we model? What mechanisms that endogenously shape lifestyle change and demand patterns can we or should we represent? Can we and how can we account for policy instruments that target demand-side mitigation solutions in our modeling framework? What should be done off-model, ex-ante, in scenario building or ex-post in the interpretation of results? What specific question do I want to answer? And what useful insights is my model best placed to give? And what is best treated with other approaches? So far, I think that the models that have quantified the low energy demand scenarios or lifestyle changes scenarios have essentially chosen to feed in the model exogenous assumptions of lifestyle changes that are quantified ex ante off model. This is a very reasonable choice, given the complexity, but it may miss key interactions, key feedbacks in the systems at play. If I come back to the low energy demand scenario with my diagram in mind, I would ask, for instance, what do people consume with the budget they don't devote to energy and cars and stuff? Wouldn't there be a rebound effect? How do they use their time? Where do people get their revenues from, if not from manufacturing, transporting, selling, repairing cars and stuff? How does employment look like? How do inequalities look like? If you believe that the low energy demand scenario is consistent with the GDP trajectory it is associated with, it means that there must be some fast economic structural change and macroeconomic rebound effect towards more activity of the service sector, but with very low energy intensity associated. Conversely, we could imagine that the economic world consistent with the low energy demand scenario is quite a more radical change than what the author described, and resembles rather the world of 2030 depicted by Keynes in his essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, in 1913, where people would work for just 3 hours a day, with productivity levels ensuring that essential material needs would be more than satisfied, allowing people to devote their time to art and culture, to family and community life, without having to worry about improving their income. I do not have readily definitive answers to those questions I raised, but I do think they are worthy of investigation and yet under studies. At CRED, these are some of the questions we are asking with our own modeling framework, the IMACLIM framework. I won't present here those ongoing experiments, but some of my colleagues are presenting their work later this week, so I would encourage you to stay tuned. With my third hat, I'm coming to the elephant in the room, the actions and policies to trigger or foster lifestyle changes. This is not my research domain, but a view from a privileged observer of French strategy and public policies on climate change as a member of the Climate Change Committee, le Haut Conseil pour le Climat. Just to be clear, the views that I will express now are my own and do not necessarily represent positions from the Haut Conseil pour le Climat. So in France, we have a target to reach net zero greenhouse gases in 2050 and a trajectory and strategy to get there detailed in a document called the National Low Carbon Strategy. Just a few facts and context. Last year, French territorial emissions were equal to about 440 million tons of CO2 equivalent, roughly 30% of which come from the transport sector, 20% from buildings, 20% from agriculture, and 20% from industry. Emissions have been decreasing, on average by 1.1% per year between 2015 and 2018, but the first target on the trajectory was missed, and a reduction of 1.9% would have been needed. Emissions need to decrease by 3.3% on average for the next decade to reach the 2030 target set on the trajectory. There is a carbon tax at about €45 per ton of CO2 that covers about 40% of total emissions. Sectors covered by the EU ETS are exempted, so are road freight transport, operations of public transport and taxis, farmers, air transport, fishing, maritime and waterway navigation, other than pleasure boating. The planned increase of the tax rate has been frozen, following the Yellow Vest movement, one of whose complaints was the unfairness of the carbon tax. It has indeed been shown by my former colleague Audrey Berry and others that the carbon tax, in its existing design, is regressive and exacerbates energy poverty. It is regressive. It represents a higher share of low-income budgets. It increases the number of households suffering from energy poverty by 200,000. This was for the context. So now, looking at the National Low Carbon Strategy itself, it is a document of about 200 pages that can be found at the link given here. A quick keyword count shows that lifestyles appears 5 times, sufficiency 19 times, whereas technology or technologies appear 92 times. There is one section specific to sufficiency, and here is what it states. Well, in French, but here is my translation. Sufficiency has an important potential for reducing emissions. The strategy promotes a sufficiency in individual and collective behaviors, evolution of social norms, etc., mainly through information, education, and awareness raising among citizens. Supply-side regulations and a clear price signal would also provide better guidance to consumers toward low-carbon consumption. Then it gives detail about the strategy that are almost exclusively about information, education, and awareness raising, with information campaigns, education programs in schools, labeling and information provision for consumers. The supply-side regulations and price signal mentioned are not detailed at all. Here, I would like to share my concern. The underlying vision seems to be one that sends the responsibility to individual consumers. Lifestyle changes are very much an injunction to households, framed in a way that refers to individual choices and is guilt-ridden. The collective nature of choices, the role of political choices and policies, the roles of other actors in other aspects than consumption choices, seems to be very much missing. On the contrary, I think it is necessary to explore seriously how to act on the contextual modifiers of choices as framed in CRED and co-authors, to act on infrastructures, to regulate advertising, to regulate production as well. And these are collective choices, political choices. Finally, I'm concerned that the question of whose lifestyles we're talking about is not raised. Here are the household's main carbon footprint per decile. It shows that households from the highest decile emit almost 3 times more than households from the lowest decile. And yet, remember, the carbon tax is regressive. This is because emission-intensive consumption is at both ends. Some basic needs, such as heating one's home, are emission or energy intensive, but some luxury consumption, such as air travel, is also emission intensive. Therefore, the key question for me is how can action and policies be designed to both manage to change richer household choices and not create or exacerbate energy poverty, and inequality issues. Any policy proposal that doesn't address seriously this question misses the point. There are options, of course, depending on how revenues of a carbon tax is used, for instance, how exemptions are designed, how financing schemes for low-carbon options are designed, etc. I strongly believe that, as researchers, we have the responsibility to confront the question, create a solid interdisciplinary knowledge basis, and engage in the public debates. To finish, let me share with you this citation from Inersi Sachs' paper I mentioned earlier. I think it is very relevant for today. Thank you for your attention.